Okay, so this is a little bit of an advanced class, all right? So if any of you are really new, have a conversation at the tea break with your friends and try and figure out what. And even those of you that have had a lot of teachings, this is a really different way of approaching Dharma than what you do in a normal public talk or in a normal kind of weekend course, because this is really under the heading of you already are on board with the Buddhist worldview. Yeah, you're already sort of on board with this as a kind of concept and a guiding principle in your life. And so knowing that, what do you do with it? But also this is from the perspective of what is called Buddhist science, which is from the aspect of the basis. So there is a way to approach this exact same material from a completely scientific perspective. And so just to kind of refresh our memories, all of the teachings of the Buddha can be divided into basis, path, and result. Yeah, we can frame all of the teachings in this way. From the perspective of the basis, the way things exist. From the perspective of the path, what do you do with it? And from the perspective of the result, what it is you're trying to achieve from it. So the basis is the two truths, relative truth and ultimate truth. And these are all things that, for the most part, can be proven through logic and reasoning. They don't rely on faith, they don't rely on religion or any particular belief system, although if you have a belief system, it's going to be more engaging to listen to, not so abstract. Okay, so the basis is relative truth and ultimate truth. And Lorig, or awarenesses and knowers, is a teaching under the category of relative truth. Okay, meaning that it's not about emptiness. Yeah, it's not about emptiness, but remember emptiness in the back of your mind, always, right? Okay, so then the path is method and wisdom. Right? So knowing about relative and ultimate truth doesn't mean that you're actually doing anything with that content, does it? It's just interesting. Yeah, like you can know some things about science, like what is a good healthy diet, but that doesn't mean you have a good healthy diet. Yeah? So it's a bit like that, okay? So the path is actually knowing the way things exist, what I actually do in my daily life about it. And what you do is you do categories related to wisdom, which is your reflections on emptiness, or the merit category or method category, which is all the good friendly stuff like compassion and kindness and patience and all of those really accessible practices. That's the path. Yeah. And then what you have after that is the result. And the result is the two Buddha bodies, the wisdom body and the form body, or the wisdom bodies and the form bodies, depending on how long a list you want. But basically, they're the result that comes from practicing method and wisdom. So by practicing wisdom, knowing about ultimate truth, thinking about emptiness again and again, the result of that is the Dharmakaya, the wisdom body of the Buddha, which is the result you need for your own welfare in order to no longer suffer, and no longer to be guided by self-grasping. So the Dharmakaya is for your own sake. This is the fully actualized aspect of the emptiness of your mind, completely developed. The form body is what you need to be of benefit to others. So if you had achieved just nirvana, you don't have a form body. Yeah, you're just abiding in a state without suffering, not causing any trouble, right? But when you practice the method side of the path, what you get is what's called the Sambhogakayas or Rupakayas, form bodies, and one of which is the emanation body and one of which is the enjoyment body. For those of you that practice Tantra, this is maybe more interesting. But just to know, this is where we're framing things. So for you as an individual, when you're looking at content, know where the content is living, but also know for yourself, what are you doing with it? Is it just an intellectual exercise that is a curiosity, something to discuss, maybe filters down a little bit into your daily life, but really is just kind of an intellectual exercise? Or is it something you're bringing home with you? And when you're bringing it home with you, what is the result you want from that? Yeah, and keep kind of looking at what is the point of all of this? And it's really up to you at what level you want to approach it. But these go into the category of the basis. Yeah, how things exist, Buddhist science. So right now in your mind, just think, all right, maybe I'll look at it from a scientific, unreligious perspective, or maybe I'll look at it with that perspective plus an idea of maybe doing something with it. Now, in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet or in India nowadays, this is the first thing the monks and nuns study. The very first thing, yeah? Like those little ones, yeah? Those little, you're like, really? Or why would you teach this to 7-year-olds? Yeah? And what kind of 7-year-olds are they? Oh my gosh. Right? But what they're doing is they're learning it by rote, right? They're learning it with just to memorize it as a topic to debate. So they're learning how to debate, they're learning how to think when they're very little monks and nuns, how to process information with logic. So this is kind of their content once they move past the stage of debating about colors and shapes that go into levels of the mind. It's interesting, isn't it, that this is the first topic? You think, good heavens. Our first topics are like, compassion is good, right? Mindfulness, yay. For them, it's this. But it doesn't mean they understand it right away. It means if they memorize these things really, really well when they're little, that's going to come in handy when they're old and their memory is shot, but now they're processing more deeply. Does that kind of make sense? Like from our own perspective, we can process things a lot more deeply than when we were young, but we don't remember as well, right? So if you had all of this stuff in your head, then you could bring it to the forefront in your adult years and really touch it. So this particular teaching, it has some very sophisticated English. Yeah, this is not common English. If you're feeling embarrassed about your English, native English speakers feel embarrassed about their English when they read this list. These are not normal words that you use in conversation, so don't be intimidated, okay? It's hard for everyone, even native English speakers. But it's also good that they're kind of different words than we talk about, because it means you don't have too much of an everyday connotation with them. You can actually start fresh. What does this word mean from scratch? Remember all the issues we had talking about attachment, because we already use that word colloquially and then trying to figure out what Buddhists mean. So actually, in a way, it's good that these are not particularly common words in conversation, because we can start from scratch. Okay, so the little monks start studying this, and they rely on a text usually by Chok, who is a kind of a great Tibetan scholar that we rely on a lot. For us in the FPMT, in the Buddhist Studies program, we do it for about 8 weeks, usually, 4 days a week for 8 weeks. So we're just gonna kind of do a bit of an overview today, and then based on how it's sinking in, I'll decide what to do in terms of the week afterwards. So if I need to slow right down and give you really introductory readings, or if you're picking it up really, really quickly, then I'll give you more advanced readings. But I didn't want to give you anything right away, just see how quickly this lands. Okay, so before we do anything to do with content, why do we study the mind? In Buddhism, just based on what you know already, what is the point of studying the mind?
That's the only point.
Because?
Because it's all about the mind.
Because, this is quite true. Because the mind is the boss, indeed. Exactly. Mind creates your reality, doesn't it? Yep.
Mind creates thoughts, and we behave according, we believe the thoughts to be true.
Exactly.
According to our thoughts.
Exactly. And then the question becomes, are all our thoughts true? Or, right? Fake news, right? We're full of fake news inside. Yeah, we have a tiny dictator inside of us telling us fake news. Yeah. Yes, same. Yeah. It's interesting, right? So I think when we're looking at why do we study the mind, we're asking, how does reality come about for us? Where does happiness and suffering come from with us? If we understand how the mind works, then we can actually do something about it. When you don't understand how the mind works, but you know that the mind is the creator of experience, you can get kind of a punishing attitude towards yourself, like trying to beat it into submission, like happiness is a state of mind. There is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way. And you can sound like a meme on the internet or like a card or something, or some like obnoxious American self-help guru or something, and then be frustrated that you're not happy. Because the mind is the creator of the happiness, but you can't force it, can you? Be happy, come on, just do it. No, it doesn't work. And even if you know your own thoughts are incorrect or going the wrong way, knowing that alone is often not enough to turn their corner, right? To turn them another direction. So the fact that we get that we're creating our own experience is not a subtle enough or specific enough knowledge to actually change our experience. Getting specific is going to really help. So this process, mainly we're going to be talking about the 7 types of awareness, which is the movement from a wrong consciousness all the way to what's called a direct perception. And what do you think is, just given the word wrong consciousness, what do you think is our worst wrong consciousness or biggest mistake in our thinking? Self. Yep, what about the self? More than merely labeled by the mind, right? Yeah, it seems that the self exists inherently. Exactly. The fundamental mistake. We think that the self exists inherently. That is a wrong consciousness. And to say, oh, it doesn't exist inherently, doesn't change you, does it? It's helpful. The first time you hear it, you go, oh, that's quite cool. Okay, the self doesn't exist inherently. Tell me more. But just knowing that hasn't necessarily changed how happy or sad you are. Yeah, just knowing that might actually give you a little window of hope. It might start to unlock certain patterns even very quickly. But there's a certain point where we kind of get stuck, right? Where it's a clear enough teaching, we've heard it enough times that we sort of understand what's happening, and now we're kind of stopped there. Yeah, we get a good, clear intellectual understanding, and then what? When we're really angry, we think, okay, I am empty of inherent existence. The words they said are empty of inherent existence. They are empty of inherent existence, but I'm really pissed off. Yeah. And part of you now is doubly mad because you shouldn't be mad. Yeah, because oh, it's all an illusion, and I'm angry. Bloody hell, right? This is what happens to us. And so intellectual understanding is our gateway. It's our gateway to deep transformation. But if it's only intellectual understanding, it's not going to do fundamental change. It'll have to be something that we have to stop, remember to do it at the right time, may or may not work. Yeah. So when we get burnt out in the Dharma or burnt out in self-transformation or spiritual path, it's probably because the methods we've been using haven't been exactly going the right way. Yeah, it's not that there's anything wrong with us or anything wrong with the path. That's the thing, right? When we feel like things aren't working, we say, I am bad or it is bad. We don't stop and think, oh, maybe I'm approaching it the wrong way, or maybe I'm missing a piece. Go back to scratch and kind of learn it all over again. Yeah, so it takes a lot of courage to stay in a beginner's mind. And I think all of you have been studying a while, and you can start to concrete your identity as someone who's studied, which collapses creativity and makes it harder to learn new things if they sound like something you've heard before. So if you can just kind of, for a moment, go back to that place in your mind when you were very new, with fewer assumptions and less certainty, but kind of a more happy, open curiousness. Yeah, remember when you were a brand new Dharma student and you were just intrigued and you didn't understand half of what was being said, but it was really interesting. Yeah, you remember that place in you? So kind of go back to that beginner's mind that doesn't have to be an expert, and now kind of feel like we are mature enough to start from the beginning, that we've studied enough and we've thought enough that now we can be beginners. Yeah, because it takes great confidence to have humility. Yeah, it takes great courage to be a beginner. Yeah, especially in a society that I don't know, actively makes you feel like you should already be an expert before even knowing anything. Yeah. So feel like you don't have to be an expert. This is brand new. Even though there are tons of things you already know, just have that really fresh, open mind. Okay? All right, so we study the mind particularly to overcome the innate view of the transitory collection, or the misapprehension of self. I'm going to throw all the synonyms at you, right? The misapprehension of self, the reifying view of the perishing aggregates, the viewing the I in one's own continuum and holding it to exist inherently, innate ignorance, that, yeah? And those all mean the same thing, right? And you're going to find all of those translations in more sophisticated texts. So to say that the root of suffering or the root of samsara is ignorance is a little bit too short, because there are a lot of types of ignorance. Yeah, so know that we're going into the deep stuff now. We're talking about a view. Yeah, we're talking about a view that is projected on a relative truth, adding extra things to it. Okay, and so, okay, first of all, let's just kind of get used to the mind conversation again. So there are levels of consciousness, remember? There are kind of three main levels of consciousness. We've got our coarse consciousness, and that is our everyday experience, mostly to do with the five senses, sometimes to do with the mental sense, but eyes, ears, nose, yeah, these basic senses are how we operate every day, yeah? And coarse consciousnesses, everyday consciousnesses, access what are called manifest phenomena, or obvious things. Yeah, things that don't need a depth or a quality to recognize. They aren't subtle. Yeah, you know this word subtle? What is it in Hebrew? Something like duck or dark or something? Oh, nothing like what I thought. Okay. Nothing like what I thought. So coarse consciousnesses, this is our everyday experience. This is what we know in terms of thought. Yeah, our thoughts are kind of surface chatter thoughts and our kind of experience of the senses. And because these coarse consciousnesses are so habituated to innate ignorance, to the reifying view of the perishing aggregates, to self-grasping at the self of persons and the self of phenomena, then all day we are trying to get the senses to make us happy. Yeah? That's why, right? So we're kind of living in our coarse consciousness, which has a strong habit of hungriness, yeah? I'm going to look at something until I'm bored, then I'm going to do something physical until I'm bored, and then I'm going to eat something until I'm bored, and then I'm going to talk about something until I'm bored, and I'm just going to ping around from sense to sense until it wears out, and then I go to the next sense, right? This is most of the day. Yeah, or all of the day. And, you know, we get little tiny snapshots of happiness or little crumbs of happiness, enough to kind of make us keep trying these strategies, because we are entertained for a second, yes? But we're not actually going into the subtle consciousness very often. And when we go into the subtle consciousness, it's usually not under our own control. Our most common experience of subtle consciousness is dreams, yeah? So when you're dreaming, how often do you know that you're dreaming? Sometimes, right? Sometimes people a lot, sometimes not so much. But if you can train yourself to lucid dream more often, that will be helpful. But if you're lucid dreaming just to have more entertainment, then you're having another 6 to 8 hours of dancing around with your senses. They're just more subtle level. Yeah, you're like, ooh, I'm dreaming, let's fly. Ooh, I'm dreaming, let's make fireworks. Yeah, so just being on top of your subtle consciousness or a little bit of control over your subtle consciousness isn't necessarily useful unless you're bringing Dharma to it. Yeah, but one really good sign that your practice is going well is if during a dream you have a choice whether to do the right thing or the wrong thing, and you decide to do the right thing. That's a really amazing sign, that even while you're dreaming, you keep your ethics. Because often we're quite ethical during the day, and then we dream and all sorts of stuff comes up, right? We're like serial killers, or we're having orgies. Who knows what you get up to in your dreams, but you're like, woo! Yeah, no rules. Yeah, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that in the immediate, but it's a sign of lack of control or lack of discipline and lack of clarity. Okay, so the dream experience is something important for us to understand because it's going to be very much like this in the bardo. In the intermediate state between this life and the next, the appearances that come to our mind are going to be in the realm of subtle consciousness, basically dancing with your own projections in a dreamlike way. So if you can see that you're dreaming while you're dreaming, you're going to have more control in the intermediate state. And when scary things appear, you're not going to think run and attack, you're going to think appearance. And when beautiful things appear in the bardo, you won't think, oh, I must have that. No, you'll think projection. Yeah? And you'll keep steady on the purpose of my life is to continue my spiritual path in order to be of benefit to all sentient beings. Yep, I see you projections, scary ones, intriguing ones, but you're just projections of my mind. I'm holding steady. Does it make sense? So those are our mostly uncontrolled subtle consciousness experiences, dreams and the bardo. It's a little bit more subtle than our everyday. Yeah.
I think that it's easier to see that you're dreaming when you're dreaming than you are
In real life.
No, it's not what I'm trying to say. It's much hard to not be afraid of real life than dreams.
Yeah, right. To break the spell in your everyday life sometimes is harder than breaking the spell of projection in your dreams sometimes, like less confronting.
I guess because when we are dreaming, it gets so crazy that most of us when we are dreaming. Real life, it's real life. We really have to do it.
Yeah, maybe. There's something to what you're saying. You know, when we're awake, we're really assuming everything is real. When we're asleep and we're dreaming, we might have more window to say, maybe this isn't real. I don't have wings, right? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, and so, it's interesting to kind of bring that same, how can you be a lucid dreamer while you're awake? Yeah, see the dream within the dream. Yeah, it's interesting because right now everything is appearing to us as very obvious and true, and there is still that illusory quality. There's still a veil over us.
And it's very hard to see this.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. So it's an interesting conversation to have with yourself of how do you approach dreams when you're the lucid dreamer? How do you bring that same awakeness to when you're awake?
But it's when you're dreaming, it's like, okay, but it's just a dream. You can't really say this because people will think you are.
Well, this is the trick, right? You're not supposed to say what you're doing in your head because you will sound crazy, right? But it doesn't mean it's not good or useful, right? To think this is just a dream is very useful. It's even one of the mind training slogans of Geshe Chakawa, right? The dream-like nature of reality, yeah? Be a child of illusion, yeah? And post-meditation, be a child of illusion. This is one of the mind training statements. It's useful, but don't tell people, right? Yeah, they'll think you're a nutter. Yeah. It depends. I mean, the example I always use is when you're watching a movie, either sucked in or not sucked into the movie. When you're watching the movie and you're sucked in, you can experience a whole trauma, tragedy, entertainment, excitement, right? When you're sucked in, right? I remember, especially like when we're teenagers and we're overly emotional anyway. I was watching I don't know, did you ever see The Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich? Oh my God, it breaks your heart. And I was just like, oh my God, the professor. I was shattered for like an hour afterwards. I was just like, oh my God, the tragedy of the human condition. I couldn't recover. It was a movie in the 30s, right? Like, no one in that movie was even alive now. Like, that's a tragedy, right? But, we can get so in the movie that it's as tragic as if our dog just got run over by a car or our mother just died. Like, it's a movie. It's not real.
What if your dog really died? What if your dog really died? That's
This is the thing is absolutely, but it's not like we're pretending that life isn't unfolding. right? It's that we need to recognize that we are attributing significance to things. The significance doesn't exist from the side of the thing, right? You know this happens, right? If you have a family and the dog belongs to the whole family, everyone's responding differently to the death of the dog, but it seems equally real to all people in the family. Yeah, it doesn't mean the dog didn't die. Yeah, but what does that mean? It seems self-evident. That is the illusion, that's the dream, that it seems self-evident. Yeah. So in some forms of meditation, you can access your subtle consciousness. And subtle consciousnesses, when they're under our control, can perceive subtle phenomena. For example, emptiness. Yeah. So when this aspect of your mind is under your own control, this is where you are seeing emptiness directly. For us, we're seeing emptiness with our coarse consciousness, which is, sort of through what's called a generic image or through a conceptual idea about it, which is still incredibly powerful, which is still really, really useful. Even if we're doing a really steady meditation on emptiness, it's still probably up here in this coarse consciousness, but it's in the mental area rather than in the sense area. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if you're perceiving emptiness directly, only emptiness appears. Yeah. Only emptiness appears. Not a nihilistic emptiness, but a space of infinite possibility. Okay? And so this is what we're aiming at, and other things will be useful if we can train this part of the mind as well. But there's actually a layer even more subtle, which is called the extremely subtle consciousness. And for us ordinary people, that is only accessible at the time of death. Yeah? At the time of death, the extremely subtle consciousness is manifest. This is what we call the clear light mind. The clear light mind. And this is the part of the mind that goes from life to life to life. This is the continuity of consciousness that's been with us from beginningless time, changing moment to moment, but an unbroken continuity. Right? So this extremely subtle consciousness is what carries karmic seeds. Yeah, it carries the unmanifest karmic seeds. And this one, if you can get under control of this one, then you can start to access extremely hidden phenomena. Now, an example of extremely hidden phenomena would be karma. And actually, no one can access all of the nuances and subtleties of karma until they're enlightened. But you'll be able to access more and more series and levels of causation the more you're able to train this level of mind. So I think interesting for us here to realize is that emptiness is actually less subtle than karma. Karma is easier to understand, but it is actually a more subtle phenomena than emptiness. Yeah. So think of, and that doesn't make sense at first until you unpack it. Okay, so think about cause and effect. The cause and effect of something very simple like a cup. Could you make a list of every single cause and condition that made just this cup? An exhaustive list. It seems like you could, right? Porcelain, paint, manufacturer, inventor of cups, blue, all the it seems like you could. Maybe it'd be a long list. But could you actually make an exhaustive list at the atomic level or subatomic level of every single condition for this cup? Right? Yeah.
You said extremely subtle consciousness manifests itself during the time of death.
Yes.
It manifests, and can we be aware of it? Or it just manifests and flies away?
So far, it just manifests and moves on. But we do want it to be something under our control.
It manifests, but we are not necessarily aware of that?
Exactly. For example, it also manifests briefly every time you fall asleep. Yeah, you go through those 8 stages at the time of death. Every time you go to sleep, yeah, you touch the clear light briefly and then ping, ping, ping back up. When you sneeze, when you have some romantic things that are happening well, right? Those are the times the extremely subtle consciousness is very briefly manifest, but it's not under your control. But it is why that we try to train ourselves in what it would be like, and we train ourselves in understanding of emptiness, so that when those two come together at the time of death, we can actually use the time of death to realize emptiness directly. Yeah, so if we're well habituated during our lifetime, we might actually use our death this time. So death is a huge opportunity for all of us. If we've been terrible meditators all life, but you're like, oh, I'm dying. Okay, good. Okay, here we go. Get ready. Yeah, right? At least now I can do something. Because think of your main distractions, right? When you're trying to meditate, your main distractions are coarse conceptual consciousnesses, like different thoughts and ideas, and your senses, right? Those are your main distractions. Thoughts about the past, thoughts about the future, entertaining yourself, getting yourself freaked out, or what's that sound? Or I want a sandwich, or whatever. Those are your main distractions, right? When your consciousness is going to its most subtle state at the time of death, the coarser and coarser levels are no longer able to support consciousness. Remember, earth can't support consciousness, and water and fire and air, they can't support consciousness anymore, which means they're not distracting the consciousness anymore, right? So you're at your least distracted state at the time of death. Most of us just are like, phew, and then we leave. But if we could actually have that, wow, I'm not distracted, stillness, non-dual experience of the extremely subtle consciousness, and see it for what it is at that time, our next rebirth would be amazing, and we would have achieved a really strong level of realization. So at the time of death, very advanced meditators stay in the death meditation for as long as they can because of the huge opportunity of not being distracted by all of those coarser consciousnesses. They're dormant. Yeah, so when you hear about these lamas who stay in death meditation for 2 or 3 weeks, that's what they're up to. They're using that amazing opportunity. Because as soon as the consciousness leaves the body, it becomes subtle again, instead of extremely subtle. And when it's subtle, it's again distracted by its own projections. Does it make sense? Yeah. So, yes.
So when we have some minutes of quietness and no thoughts, it's still the coarse consciousness?
Yeah. I know, it's disappointing. But at least it's quiet in there for a minute, right? Yay, right? At least you get a moment of peace. Absolutely. And that's also what we need to figure out is when our meditation is still and clear and quiet, is it spacious or is it spacey? Yeah? Is it bright and clear or is it vague? Yeah? Because when it's vague and when it's spacey, that's subtle laxity. Yeah. Yeah, so it's tricky because it's pleasant. Yeah? That subtle laxity is like, yeah, but it's not useful. And it creates a habit of disassociation and spacing out and general distraction. Yeah. So, okay, so coarse, subtle, extremely subtle, out of control for us right now, but eventually under our control at all levels when we start working with these 7, which I'll introduce. Yeah.
Say that when consciousness leaves the body, it comes back to the subtle.
Yeah, during the bardo.
Because it gets near another body.
Well, remember that when the consciousness leaves the body, it's traveling on an extremely subtle wind body. So it's already become more coarse in order to leave and move. Yeah, and so now it's in that dreamlike experience until it sees the conditions for birth and then is propelled by karma to enter form, say, if you're going to become a human again, and then you become coarse consciousness again. Yeah. Well, and what's happening here is let's just establish a framework to talk within. Yeah, and hopefully there's an aspect of all of these that you sort of have experience of. You don't have to trust me or trust the Dharma because you're trusting your own direct experience. Yeah? So the words I'm saying, you're examining in a good way, which is through logic and reasoning, but also bring in your own experience of, isn't it true that there's a coarse level of your consciousness that is more sensorial? And isn't it true that there's kind of something more subtle that happens in dream and maybe a good meditation? And isn't it true that sometimes right as you fall asleep, maybe you touch a flash of clarity or a flash of something less conceptual? So what you're saying is you don't need to trust me or the Dharma. You don't need to listen in any particular way except to bring it to your own experience again and again. And when you can't touch it with experience, see if you can touch it with logic. And if you can't touch it with logic, see if you can touch it from the perspective of relying on a teacher who has so far not lied to you, which is Shakyamuni Buddha. Yeah, and I'm just saying my understanding of his teachings. But the Buddha is not lying to us. And we've
Might be wrong. Of course he's not lying.
Sure, he might be wrong, sure. But I think that you ask yourself, and these are good questions to ask ourselves, is if what he's saying makes sense in an everyday way, some basic teaching like on patience, right? Something that is easy enough to understand. And you try out doing the different strategies he's recommended, and they work, then you go, oh, he was right. I bet those other things he said were right too. But I'll see. I'm not going to just take it on face value, right? So, the teaching that the Buddha gave when he was talking about how to listen, he was saying, don't take my words just because I said so. Test them like a goldsmith tests gold, right? By cutting and burning and rubbing. And he gave the teaching on the 4 reliances. And the first one was, don't rely on the teacher, rely on the teachings. And don't rely on the words, rely on the meaning. And don't rely on the provisional meaning, rely on the definitive meaning. And don't rely on mere intellectual understanding, but the deep experience. Yeah? So, like this is how to listen. Yep. Yeah, good question. Yep, other questions about these 3 levels or related? Yeah. You have to say compared to what, right? So to say that the consciousness in the bardo is subtle, not extremely subtle, we have to understand what is extremely subtle. Because the bardo experience is still more subtle than our everyday coarse experience, right? There are 3 levels, right? So what is this last level? What is extremely subtle consciousness? This extremely subtle consciousness, this clear light mind, is like the emptiness of the mind. It's its lack of inherent existence. Some other traditions might call it ground luminosity, right? And at this level, there is no coarse senses. Yeah, there is no sight, no sound, no taste. There is also a natural non-duality. There is no sense of subject and object. As soon as the consciousness leaves the body, there is a sense of subject and object, which already makes it more coarse than when it was in the fundamental state. Just a concept of subject and object, duality is present. Yeah? That's more coarse, isn't it, than non-duality, right? So it's a subtle and refined thing traveling on a wind body. It's doing well in terms of subtlety generally, but it's not the most subtle. And we don't have as much experience of the most subtle. We have more experience of the subtle, right? We have experience of dream states. Yeah. So it's subtle, but it's not as subtle as it could be, right? Yeah, remember those 8 stages at the time of death, going progressively more and more and more subtle, right? You're released from more and more levels of coarse distraction until there, and when you're in that body, you're still kind of living in the central channel that was established in the previous life, right? Which at no other time, unless you're a great meditator, are you there. Yeah, it's the first time you've actually entered into the central channel. The rest of your life, you're hanging out on the sides. Yeah. So, you don't have to take my word for it. Do some deep meditation on the 8 stages at the time of death. See if you can touch the extremely subtle consciousness, and then compare it to your experience of subtle consciousness. See how it goes? See how it goes? You had a question?
Yeah, it's more like a thought. Like, if everybody's consciousness is different in a way, then does that mean that subtle consciousness and extremely subtle consciousness of every person is also a little bit different? Or is it?
The extremely subtle consciousness of everyone is of identical type. The emptiness is of identical type. But the relative aspect has different karmic seeds carried on it. So it's like from an ultimate perspective, we all have an identical type of mind stream, clear and knowing and empty of inherent existence. But from a relative perspective, it's accumulated different karmic seeds, consciousness by consciousness.
Which manifests differently when each consciousness
Takes rebirth.
accesses the extremely subtle consciousness.
When it goes more coarse, it functions differently. When it's at its most fundamental state, it's qualified by habituation. Yeah, but that habituation isn't it. So for example, if you are a strong meditator in your lifetime, then when you are in the extremely subtle consciousness, the habituation of that you can bring to the subtle consciousness for it to recognize itself, right? So if you hadn't done that, it would just arise in the way that it arises from everyone, for everyone, but you wouldn't recognize it because you hadn't qualified the relative aspect with that prior training. Does that make sense? Theoretically, right? Yeah, exactly. No, we don't, but we do understand continuity of consciousness when we do those very simple meditations of what came before this moment, which came before this moment, which came before this moment. So, if you have a really sudden mood, it can feel like your mood came out of nowhere without cause. But if you were to have enough self-awareness and kind of deep introspection, you would say, from that there was this moment, and before that there was this moment, and you can trace it back to, that was actually the catalyst for this particular eruption of mood. You could trace it back, yeah. And so the continuity of consciousness is that aspect that has been qualified by its karmic cause and effect over beginningless time, but not contaminated by it. This is when we talk about stains being adventitious or extra. They're additional to, they're removable. So think of us all as pure, clean rivers that have accumulated different kinds of debris. Yeah.
The extremely subtle consciousness is carrying the karmic imprints.
Yeah.
It almost feels like the subtle consciousness is turning the volume of the imprints. The coarse consciousness is like making a party of all of them.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. I think it's a bit like that. Yeah, I think there's something to that. Because when karmic imprints are latent or like sleeping, they're not doing anything in particular. Yeah? They're not causing us happiness and suffering, they're latent. It's when they get watered, or sunlight, of our conditions that they then sprout into experience of happiness, suffering, or neutrality. So in the very subtle consciousness, we have tons of karmic imprints riding along, but they're not exploding into life. Yeah? They're not causing any particular trouble. But even imprints, say we had removed karmic seeds or burnt our karmic seeds, the imprints still give the appearance of true existence. So that's why we want not just the seeds, but also the imprints to be gotten rid of for full omniscience, but also in order to not grasp at true appearance. Look, these are interesting things, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just sit with it a little bit. And we're not going to be able to prove experientially to ourselves all of this, except to remember that you do know the difference in the quality of your mind in an everyday way, as opposed to a good meditation, as opposed to a place you touched maybe in sleep or some other event, that there are different things happening. And we also know from experience, sometimes we have control and sometimes we don't. And that control can be increased through habituation. Because there are already areas in our life where we are more controlled, aren't there? Right? There are some relationships where you are more careful. Yeah, where did that carefulness come from? It wasn't self-arising carefulness. There was a series of events that reinforced themselves so that now with this relationship you're always careful, whereas this one you're more distracted. Yeah, so we know that the mind is trainable. We have inner proof of that. And so the question becomes, is there a systematic way to train the mind into happiness and wisdom in a stable way that doesn't change? Maybe, because so far there's been some training. Yeah, so far, yeah. So we'll just see how it goes, but let's have a little break and come back in 20 minutes.